them. So in that pattern matching activity, there were really two things that I wanted you to see about those molecules you were looking at. And I mean, as an aside, those didn't look like molecules, did they? They were like lines and they were the equivalent of stick figures. And so just like a stick figure, it's a representation of something that doesn't actually look like the thing. But it's still pretty meaningful. When you started on Monday, grouping those together, everybody here was able to group some of them with no problem at all. There were the ones that kind of looked like this is a simplified version of it, but they sort of had this general look. They were relatively small, and they had like one line and then some connections, and there were some H's, and I can't remember if they put the C's on them or not, but these ones all looked the same. Like these were like, there were some OH's in here as well, like would have looked something like this, right? And so these were all over the place, really easy to lump those together. And then there were some ones that were really, really long, and I don't remember exactly what these looked like, just so you know, but it's the exact appearance doesn't matter, but there were ones that were really, really long, and they maybe had like an oxygen on them, but mostly it was like carbon and hydrogens. Something like this, right? And so those were pretty easy to match up, and those were even like, those were horizontal, so everybody oriented them the same way. So we had these kind of long, the sort of shorter vertical straight ones, these longer horizontal straight ones, and then there were some other ones that that you probably pieced together. There was a group, and I don't remember exactly what these looked like the way they were drawn out, but it was something like, it had a H3N plus at one end, and then there was some other garbage in here, and then over here would have been like COO minus O or something like that. I don't even remember. And it doesn't matter because you would have seen this. It had like one side with this and one side with like a tail that kind of looked like this. And those were really easy to lump together. And so there was a visual piece to this. Visually, it was pretty easy to see which of these went together. That should have gotten you to 6 or 7 different categories if you just grouped the ones together that were visually similar. And then what was interesting is if then you wanted to lump them together into more condensed categories, the idea was to try to get to 4. There really wasn't a way to do it visually. Because what you would have found is either you put things together and then I came around and said, these don't go there, these don't go there, these don't go there, or you on your own were looking at them and saying, well, I see some similarities, but I see some differences too, so I don't understand why these two would go together, whereas these two wouldn't. And it turns out that the trick to lumping together the rest of those categories are the ingredients. So the ingredients, that's not how you spell the word, ingredients, had to do with the specific letters that were involved. So you might notice here, for example, that these ones that were sort of short, vertical, straight had carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and it had kind of a lot of oxygen. So there was one that had carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and there were lots of oxygens. And then there was this kind. It was a little bit different because it had carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but it didn't have much oxygen. It just wasn't nearly as much of it. So that's one pattern that you might have noticed. You might have also noticed that some of them had nitrogen in them. Some of them had phosphorus. You might not have known what these letters meant, but you would have seen them. And it turns out that the key to understanding these molecules, key to understanding how they work, is recognizing that what matters is what they do. And what determines what they do is two things. Two things that factor in to how these things work. One of those things is their physical shape. The shape matters, okay? So lumping all of these together because they look similar is a good move. Lumping all these together because they look similar is a good move because their function is partially determined by their shape. So function is determined by shape, but it's also determined by individual ingredients. So some of the ones that had this phosphorus didn't look really similar, but the fact that it has this phosphorus means that it's going to behave in a certain way. Phosphorus kind of plays this role chemically, and it does the same thing over and over and over again, which means those chemicals that have phosphorus can get lumped together as well. So it's determined by shape and the ingredients. And that was the key to lumping all these things together, is recognizing that phase one, you look at their shape, their structure. Phase two, you look for specific ingredients. And it turns out that the 4 categories we were looking for, most of you figured this out because you've done a little bit of research into this, even though we haven't as a group talked about it. But the 4 things that we were looking for were proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. And it turns out that those 4 different things are determined by shape and ingredients. So what I'm going to do now, and the stuff that I want you all to write down, is I'm going to go through all of these different categories of chemicals. These chemicals are going to be referred to in a variety of ways. They are called biochemical macromolecules or biochemical compounds. We'll see the amoeba sisters in a few minutes. We'll refer to them as biomolecules. It's all the same basic idea, which is that these are the substances that are really important in living organisms. There's lots of other things that are involved, but these are the ones that are most important. So our goals today are to figure out what are these main categories of living organisms. What are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids? What kind of distinguishes those things? And then we'll think about what they look like, what their ingredients are, and how they operate inside living organisms. All right, I'm going to try this and we'll see if this works. It was working yesterday. Look at that. Finally figured it out. Okay, so what it starts with is an acronym. This acronym right here, CHONPS. If you try to say it, you might, like I do, sort of trip over the word chomps. It's not chomps. There's no M. Chomps. And it's a little hard to say, but it's actually kind of easy to remember. And basically what this describes are the main chemicals that are found in living organisms, right? So these letters stand for the first letter of the elements, kinds of atoms that are found in living things. You can do it. All right, so the first one, the C, stands for carbon. The second one, oh, look at that. This is just the weirdest, there just has to be a better way to do this. It really should be easier. Okay, all right, well, I'll drive from here momentarily. Okay, so the first one is carbon. The second one, the H, stands for hydrogen. The O stands for oxygen. The N stands for nitrogen. The P stands for phosphorus. and the S stands for sulfur. And here's what you should know about these things. You do not need to know like specifically what they are. You do know a few of them already. Carbon we talked about is so critically important because it's unique chemically. It can make all these really cool connections. So we talked about carbon specifically. Hydrogen and oxygen. We didn't talk about each individual piece. We'll talk a little bit more about oxygen when we talk about respiration. But hydrogen and oxygen together commonly form water. We talked a bunch about water. We did the Water Olympics, and then we talked about pH. So carbon is important to have an idea of like what's special about carbon. Hydrogen and oxygen, it's important to know those come from water. Those are the basic pieces of water. And then nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. You don't need to know the specifics of those things. The only thing you need to really recognize is that they're pretty abundant in our bodies. There are lots of other things that are in our bodies too. In fact, if you get a multivitamin, a package of multivitamins like this is like a drink mix, and you look at it, you'll see all sorts of other things here. I see calcium, I see sodium, I see magnesium, zinc, something called manganese, chromium, potassium, and it turns out without those things, we cannot survive. Living organisms require those things. All of those ingredients are critical. These are not the most important. I mean, they are of critical importance, but without, say, potassium, none of us could be here. Potassium is critical. It's just that we don't need a ton of it. We need a whole bunch of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. We need smaller amounts of everything else. So typically, what we would see is if we look at one of these biochemical molecules, one of these biochemical compounds, what we'd see is most of it is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Okay? And so let's go through them one by one, and I'm going to introduce a couple of vocabulary words here that are not too difficult to understand. So the first group is called carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are what are called a polymer. And a polymer is what you get when you hook together individual pieces to make something bigger that still is very clearly made up of those individual pieces. The example that people often use for polymers, like the analogy, is a train, because each train is made up of cars that are hooked together. All the cars are identical. Like you look at a train, you can see that's a car, that's a car, that's a car, that's a car. Hook them all together and you get a train. A carbohydrate is made up of these little pieces that are hooked together. And they can be hooked together in a variety of ways, and there's a variety of pieces that can be used to hook them together. Each little piece is called a monomer, and we'll see in a second that in carbohydrates it has a specific name. And the whole structure together is called a polymer. Carbohydrates can exist as simple monomer structures called monosaccharides. So the basic building block of carbohydrates is called a monosaccharide, and we often will refer to that as a simple sugar. Examples of simple sugars are this right here, which you had in your pattern matching activity. I know you probably didn't recognize it, but this is called fructose. You've all heard of fructose. Fructose is a natural substance, but when people in the 50s and 60s and 70s figured out that if they take corn syrup and they process it, they can make it taste really sweet by increasing the amount of fructose in it, and that's where we got high fructose corn syrup. And it turns out that high fructose corn syrup is kind of problematic for our health because we love the way it tastes, our bodies crave it, and it's not particularly good for us. Fructose itself, though, is perfectly natural. If you eat a piece of corn, you're eating fructose. If you eat, fructose is named fructose because it's commonly found in fruits. Okay? Another monosaccharide simple sugar is called glucose. Glucose is one of the most important monosaccharides. It is the sugar that is processed by our cells to get energy, all right? And so this is a really critical one, and we'll look at this when we talk about photosynthesis and respiration. If you hook some carbohydrates together, you can get polymers, and those polymers can be really, 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 really long, or they can be relatively short. For example, if you take one fructose and one glucose and hook them together, you get sucrose, which is table sugar. If you buy sugar at the store, that is a polysaccharide, polymer, made up of one fructose and one glucose hooked together. And then there's other things that we can make from carbohydrates. We can make really, really, really long chains. Those can store energy, but they can also do other stuff as well that we'll talk about in just a second. So when you look at carbohydrates, they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And there's lots of oxygen. The carbo in carbohydrates stands for carbon. The hydrate, you know what it means to be hydrated, right? It means that you have lots of water. And if you look at this chemical structure right here for glucose, you can see, remember the intersections are carbons? So there's carbon, 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 carbon. 6. There's 6 carbons in each piece of glucose. And then look at what's attached to the carbons. Hydrogen and a hydroxide, H2O. Another hydrogen and hydroxide, H2O, 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 H2O. There is a ton of water in these carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are what you get when you take water molecules and basically attach them to carbons. And so that's where they get their name. So the structure is that they're made of the CH and lots of oxygen. Their function is 2 things primarily. One is chemical energy. So there's lots of different ways that we can store chemical energy in sugars. Some of it's more accessible, some of it's less accessible. Glucose is the easiest for cells to use. Glucose is really critical. All other simple sugars, or even hooked together pieces of sugar, your body will process and turn into glucose first. So when you eat table sugar, when you eat sucrose, your body will break that apart into fructose and glucose, and then it'll take the fructose and turn it into glucose so that it can then get energy from it. We can also get energy from real long chains of carbohydrates called starch. So potatoes have a lot of starch in them. Those are sugars. They don't taste sweet, but they are long polymers of monosaccharides hooked together. We can also make lots of structural things out of carbohydrates. So our bodies have carbohydrates between our cells. Our bodies use carbohydrates as building blocks for things, but not so much. The biggest building block in our bodies are the cells themselves, and then proteins. We have lots of structural proteins. But you know what's amazing at using carbohydrates for building materials is plants. If you looked at the stem of a plant, it's mostly carbohydrate. And if you look at a tree, it's mostly carbohydrate. Trees hook monosaccharides together in such a way to make an incredibly sturdy molecule called cellulose. And cellulose is so sturdy and so strong that it can support trees that are hundreds of feet tall, 10 feet wide, anchored into the soil. So you all saw like trees blowing, like branches breaking and trees falling apart in this windstorm that we had last night, but not many. Like most of the trees around town are still standing. And some of them are really tall. Imagine how strong those trees must be to withstand a 40-mile-an-hour gust of wind that hits it at the top. Yeah?
So classical guitar strings are polymer, does that mean it's made from carbohydrates?
Say that again?
So a classical guitar string is
Oh,
polymer?
that's a great question. So yeah, so the question was, are all polymers carbohydrates? No. Carbohydrates are a type of polymer. A polymer in general is what you get when you hook smaller pieces together. So when you talk about plastic guitar strings, those are a polymer. They're made up of little chunks of something hooked together to make a really long chain, but it's not carbohydrates. They're what are called, it's basically a petroleum product. It's a hydrocarbon. It doesn't fall into any one of these categories because they're not typically found in living organisms. We don't have plastic in us. I mean, we do now, but we didn't naturally. All right, let's talk about lipids. So lipids are not polymers. Lipids are not, you can't find one basic small part that's repeating to make a lipid. But they're still a biochemical molecule. They're made of C, H, and O as well, but not much oxygen. So when you were using the pattern matching activity, those molecules that you found that were really, really, really long, that had a bunch of carbon and hydrogen, and then a little bit of oxygen and nothing else, those were all lipids. And lipids have some really important functions as well. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly because most of these you either know already or we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about. The most important one that you all know about is that lipids are often used for energy storage. And I just told you that carbohydrates are used for energy storage. And some of you probably know, hey, wait, proteins. You get energy from proteins too. So what's the deal with these three things? And the answer is that they all can be used for energy storage, but they are used for different kinds of energy storage. When you have lipids being used for energy storage, it's more of a long-term thing. They're pretty stable. They're kind of hard to break apart. They store a lot of energy, but your body can't get at it quickly. Carbohydrates are great for short-term energy storage. They don't last long in your body. If you have carbohydrates in your body and you don't replenish them, they'll just kind of go away. But your body can use them really quickly to get the energy that it needs. Proteins are a little bit different. With proteins, they're mostly used for two functions that we'll see shortly, structure, and they are used in chemical reactions. They do have energy in them, but our bodies don't need protein primarily for the energy in the proteins. We need proteins for the ingredients in the proteins. There's some ingredients in proteins that we just can't get any other way. So that's why we need to consume them. So lipids store energy. Lipids, we'll look at this down the road, are really important for the structure of cell membranes. There's something called a phospholipid. That's going to be the main lipid that we study. Phospholipids are actually, they're categorized as lipids, but they have a little bit of sugar in them, and they have something else that's neither lipid nor sugar. So they're really a complicated, hooked together molecule that in general is more like a lipid than anything else. And we'll talk about those when we talk about cells. Lipids are used as protection for drying out, and this is kind of interesting. You don't need to write it down, but like one of the reasons that our skin can get oily is that it retains moisture. Those oils on the surface of our skin keep moisture in our cells. Plants have leaves that are sort of waxy. And sometimes you can feel how waxy they are. Other times you can sort of see they're sort of waxy and shiny. It's not the kind of wax you can scrape off, but it's like it's sort of embedded in the structure of the leaf. And what that does is it prevents the leaf from drying out. Lipids can be used as insulation, both structurally and temperature insulation. So organisms that, for example, live in really cold climates can store a lot of lipids in something called blubber, and that blubber is for insulation more than anything else. It keeps the inside of their bodies warm when the outside air is really cold. We also have insulation inside our bodies to protect and cushion our organs. And this is one where I just want to touch on this real briefly because as somebody who works with young people and has young children, I'm pretty aware of a lot of the really scary, like ideas that people get about their bodies that affect their health. And you all, I hope, have heard about things like body dysmorphia, eating disorders. These are things that almost certainly you know people who are struggling with these issues. It's very likely that some of you in this classroom are struggling with these issues. And one of the things that can happen is when people become overly concerned with their physical appearance, in particular when they become overly concerned with the idea that they need to be thinner, they get thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. And one of the things that can happen that's really dangerous is that they can lose that protective structural insulation. You can damage your organs by dieting. And I want to be clear that eating well and getting lots of exercise is a great goal. But it concerns me a lot the degree to which people are obsessed with looks, and I would encourage you to talk to responsible, trusted adults about this kind of stuff, to do research in using trusted materials. If you're getting your information from like YouTube influencers or random people making TikTok videos or your peers, you should be very careful about how you assimilate that information. I know nobody uses Facebook anymore, like old people do, like me. We use Facebook, but you all use Snapchat and Instagram, right? Like that's the, I mean, am I right that that's kind of what most people are using, Snapchat and Instagram, right? Okay, so here, I don't have a Snapchat or an Instagram account. I do get on Facebook just to like stay in touch with like information. I don't post pictures of my family. I don't do any of the social media stuff. I just like, there's like places where you can go to like buy and sell stuff that you don't want anymore. And that's how I use Facebook. But here's what's really interesting. If you go to somebody's profile on Facebook and you click on selfies, you will consistently see a pattern in the comments. Either the comments will all be like, oh my gosh, you're so beautiful, you look so lovely, just as gorgeous as ever. Or you'll see comments like, bleh, dorky, 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 oh, I remember when we used to go skiing. And you know what is really terrifying to me is those two types of comments are split almost perfectly by gender. People who identify as male will get comments on their selfies like, go dude, rock on, like have fun. People who identify as female will get comments like, oh, you're so beautiful. And the message is consistent over and over and over again. If you are a young woman in this country and in most other countries as well, the single most important thing is to look good. That's all that seems to matter on social media. And that scares me a lot. It scares me because of this. It scares me because it leads to body dysmorphia and eating disorders and poor health choices. And it scares me because it's like it reduces you to something that to a certain extent you have no control over. And being a guy has its challenges as well. Like we're not immune to this, but it's a little bit of a different world. I recognize that. Like when I think of my own 3 kids, I worry far more about how YouTube influencers are going to affect my daughter than I do about how they're going to affect my sons. My sons are very much less likely to consistently get the message that the only thing that matters is whether other people think they're good looking. Whereas those of you who are young women, you will, if you have, I mean, I know I'm right, I don't even need to ask. Like if you look at the information, the comments that you get, the Instagram, the Snapchat, if you look elsewhere, what you'll see over and over and over and over again is that's what's emphasized. And I think that's just about the least important thing about you all. When I look at you, what I see is like vibrant, young, healthy people. And to me, I wish you could see you with my eyes, because what I see, you all look so good to me. Like I love the fact that you're here and just like being you. And it's who you are that I see. And as you get older, that's all that is gonna matter. Who you are is gonna matter a lot more than what you look like. And so I'm taking this opportunity to strike a blow against the like socially determined norm that the only thing that matters, in particular for young women, is whether or not you're good looking enough, because it just doesn't matter. I know how it feels because I've been there, but in the long run, it doesn't matter. All right. So that's my brief TED talk. Okay, and then the last thing that lipids do in terms of function is they can regulate some cell activities, and primarily that has to do with signaling molecules called hormones or steroids. So hormones can be proteins. Steroids are a type of signaling molecule that's made from lipids. And so cholesterol is one, testosterone is one. These steroids are really important for our like growth and development. It's how our brain communicates to the rest of the cells in our body. It's how individual organs in our body, like our thyroid gland, communicates with the rest of the organs in our body. We're not going to go into that too much. If you end up taking anatomy and physiology, you'll look more at steroids and how they function in living organisms. The next category is nucleic acids. Nucleic acids, like carbohydrates, are polymers. So there's a little tiny piece, a very basic piece of a nucleic acid, and it's called a nucleotide. So nucleotides are made of sugar. There's a little piece of sugar that's right here. There's something called a phosphate group, and you saw this in the pattern matching activity. It had a P, and then it was surrounded by O's with some like negative signs. And then it has something called a nitrogenous base, which is basically carbon and nitrogen and hydrogen hooked together in these rings. And what nucleic acids are used for, the structure, as I just kind of said, is they have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and they have nitrogen and phosphorus as well. So the structure of these nucleic acids includes nitrogen and phosphorus, and that's the big difference, right? Like when you look at this piece right here, this is a sugar. It's an actual little piece of sugar, but because it's hooked to this piece that has all this nitrogen, this piece that has phosphorus and a whole bunch of oxygen, functionally it ends up being really different, okay? The main function of nucleotides is to store and communicate genetic information. So DNA and RNA are primary types of nucleic acids. And the bad news is you're gonna have to know all of this. You're gonna have to know what DNA is, how it works, how it's put together. You're gonna have to know what RNA is. You're gonna need to know the difference between messenger RNA and transfer RNA. You're gonna need to know how the information in DNA gets moved to an RNA molecule, and then how that is interpreted with transfer RNA and ribosomes and all sorts of crazy things to make proteins. The good news is you don't have to know any of that stuff now. For now, all you need to realize is that nucleic acids store genetic information. When we talk about cells and we move to talking about genetics, that's when we'll talk in more detail about how all of this genetic information works together inside living organisms. So for now, we'll keep it simple. Nucleic acids store genetic information. Boom, we're done. The last kind of molecule is a protein. And proteins are the ones on your pattern matching activity that had that H3N plus. And in this drawing right here, it looks a little different, but it's basically the same idea. And then, so this had one side with an H3N plus, and then this one had that tail with the carbon and the oxygens, right? And what you get with proteins is you get this middle section that's always the same. It's got one side with a nitrogen, It's got one side with a carbon and a couple of oxygens. In the middle, there's a carbon, and then that is hooked to something that can really vary. And the something that can really vary is called the R group, and that's because scientists are awful, and rather than give it a name that's meaningful, they just call it the R group. These proteins are polymers. Each one of these pieces right here is called an amino acid, and that's the monomer. So proteins are made up of smaller pieces called amino acids. For all living organisms on this planet, there are 20 different amino acids. For all those amino acids, the left and the right hand part of the amino acid is the same, and the middle part is different. What makes amino acids different is this R group. It's different in each one. Some of them have nitrogen and or sulfur in them. So the ingredients for proteins are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which we can see is present in all amino acids, and then nitrogen and sulfur. Nitrogen and sulfur shows up in these R groups. And I mentioned that the ingredients of things affects their function. And this is a really good example because it turns out that if you have R groups with sulfur in them, they can make little connections. And those sulfur atoms kind of stick together just a little bit. It's not a super strong connection, but it's enough that it can change the shape of a long chain of amino acids. And that, for the record, is how hair gets curly. Your hair is curly in part because these sulfur bonds kind of stick together. Hair is protein. And so people who have curly hair have these sulfur bonds connected. If you've straightened your hair, if you know somebody who's straightened their hair, the process of straightening your hair breaks these bonds temporarily. And so your hair kind of uncurls, but then these are still there. It doesn't get rid of the sulfurs. So when they get close enough, like when your hair gets wet and it kind of like tangles up, then those sulfur bonds reform. And so that's a physical manifestation of how the ingredients in different proteins affect the function of the protein itself. When we think about the functions of proteins, there's a couple things that we'll focus on. One is structure. So, and you don't have to write down this for example, sorry. Structural proteins are often used for structure. So hair, your fingernails, cartilage. There's connective tissue in our bodies. Protein in humans is really critical structurally. The main thing that we're going to talk about is enzymes. So enzymes are proteins that speed up chemical reactions. And then there's all sorts of other things that proteins can do. Proteins can be used for transport. Proteins can be used for defense. Proteins can be used as signaling molecules. So some of the cell signals that your body communicates with are created with proteins. Those proteins communicate that information. The two things we're going to focus on is structure, but mainly what we're going to look at is proteins functioning as enzymes. Okay, so so that's the overview. Here's how we're going to look at this stuff. When it comes to lipids, we're going to talk about phospholipids in the context of cell membranes. That's not going to be for a while. When it comes to sugars, we're going to primarily look at sugars in terms of energy, and we're going to look at how they work in other chemical reactions in the cell involving other biochemical compounds. So we're going to look a lot at sugars, but when we look at sugars, we're primarily going to be thinking about sugars as they are affected by these things called enzymes. Nucleic acids, we're going to look at down the road when we talk about genetics and start thinking about like the internal workings of a cell. Right now, we're gonna focus primarily on enzymes. Our work for the next couple of weeks is gonna center around these enzymes. So I'm gonna play a quick Amoeba Sisters video because the Amoeba Sisters they do a great job of explaining this stuff, and they can do like animation and things that I can't. So what you're gonna hear is basically a recap of what the information that I just gave you, but I think it'll help you all kind of visualize how these things work. So hopefully this is gonna work. We're gonna have to get through an ad here.